So first of all, hello and welcome to tonight's presentation titled Opportunities in Global Markets, the Importance of Facts versus Feelings. My name is Nicholas Pateris. I'm one of the co-founders and directors of Wilson Pateris, and I'll be your host for tonight's evening. Before we commence the presentation, I'll just do a quick run-through of tonight's proceedings. Our first presenter will be Wilson Pateris' own Don Hans, who will provide us a little more context around international investments from a Wilson Pateris perspective, followed by our keynote speaker, Kerr Neilson. Kerr's presentation will conclude at approximately 7 p.m, and then we'll take us to the floor for a few questions from the audience, and we'll conclude around 7:30. We've also got plenty of drinks and canapes available, so please make sure to make the most of the catering provided. Tonight we're also joined by quite a number of the Wilson Pateris team. So we have here tonight my fellow director Chris Wilson in attendance, financial advisor Lasati Felsinger, business services principals Nick Street, Sash Nikolovsky, Mark Ford and Brendan Farmer, and lending and finance manager Tony Coleman. This evening's presentation has been specially selected by Wilson Pateris. We at Wilson Pateris believe that in order to maximise our clients' wealth, our clients should remain highly informed and consider a broad range of investments as a key part of constructing their investment portfolio. What we do recognise that far too often, alternatives such as international investments can be overlooked, and this is really a combination of the fear of the unknown for a lot of people, and lack of access to qualified and quality information around international investments. So we really do have a simple investment philosophy at Wilson Pateris. It's to know what you're investing in. And so for us tonight, what better way to get to know international markets and international investments than have Kerr Neilson in attendance. In relation to Kerr and his presentation tonight, a little bit of historical context. In this year's financial review, the organisation that Kerr co-founded, Platinum Asset Management, was referred as the $27 billion platinum trailblazer in the Australian market for the opening up of global equity strategies over 25 years ago. So first of all, over to Don Hans. I'd like to invite Don up to the stage. Don is Wilson Pateris' lead investment advisor and has managed investment portfolios in Australian superannuation funds for over 30 years. Don prides himself on exceptional client service and proactively working with clients to meet their goals. Thanks, Don.
Now I've got to do this because I don't think my face has ever been up in lights before, so for the rest of the 5 minutes that I've got, I'm obviously the one at the top, and my associate Lasati is the one right beside me. Thank you very much everybody for coming tonight. It was kind of interesting because when we sent out the original email, we basically said, are you interested in listening to a presentation on international, this is fantastic with the glasses because I can see my notes but I can't see anyone in the audience, so if I've got a strange looking face, that's the account of that. So we sent out an email saying, would you like to come and listen? And I would like to thank the 3 people that RSVP'd to that. We thought there's only 2 opportunities here. We're either going to have to scrap tonight's presentation, Kerr, or take a different tack. So we decided to send out the email deliberately on the basis if you ignore international equities, then you do at your peril. At Wilson Pateris, we do, and maybe Nick in part alluded to it, and that is acknowledge that for some people, maybe international equities might be a little bit of a mystery. Certainly when you look at the statistics in relation to self-managed super funds, just as an example, the exposure to international equities is not as high as it ought to be. But maybe there's a little bit of mystery, maybe it's the fact that there's a little bit of lack of knowledge, or maybe it's also something to do with confidence. But hopefully at the end of the 3.5-hour presentation tonight, that you will go home that convinced, and we'll have to put additional people on the reception tomorrow to take your phone calls. But put in context, the Australian share market represents 1.8% of the world's share market. So on that basis, there's lots of other opportunities. Companies like, just by way of example, and just to identify for Kerr that I have read the 30th of June financial reports, but companies like Facebook, or whether it be Intel, whether it be Mitsubishi, whether it be Johnson & Johnson, and everyone goes into their bathroom and you're going to have Johnson & Johnson gear in there. As an aside, they announced a massive profit overnight, but we move on to Mitsubishi, to Roche, to Samsung, etc., etc. These are all companies that are listed on a stock exchange in a galaxy far, far, far away. That's a bit of a take-off from Star Wars, isn't it? But they certainly don't appear on the Australian Stock Exchange. Kerr and Andrew Clifford established Platinum back in 1994, and their mission on face value was a simple one. That was to build portfolios of maybe not companies that everybody else hated, but companies that were misunderstood. And that is part of the reason, if you like, when you look at the Platinum stable, the funds that they have look different, feel different, and are different. So Platinum over the last 24 or 25 years, or whatever, I'm not an accountant so I won't add it all up, but maybe 24 years, has established a worldwide record in terms of international funds management. And I know that Kerr will look at the issue of the behavioural issues facing investors in the market today. It's interesting when you have a look, and it's been this way for a little while, that Platinum's funds do have a distinct bias to Asia, and within that bias to Asia, in particular to China, and lo and behold to Japan, which might surprise some people sitting in the audience tonight. So in this context, I suppose part of the question is whether tomorrow's winners might indeed be on a stock exchange other than the Australian Stock Exchange. Many of you I know are clients of Wilson Gutierrez, and within that many are also clients of either Lasardi or myself. And I suppose we keep on saying that a portfolio ought to be diversified. It should have some exposure to the main asset classes, and of all the asset classes, we shouldn't be ignoring international equities. I put this chart up here. I deliberately did it so you couldn't read any figures, but it is identifying that the different asset classes will do different things at different times, but it's a net result that we're looking for. We believe at Wilson Gutierrez that we do have a unique way of constructing investment portfolios on behalf of clients that are focused on positive investment outcomes. I was trying to remind Kerr earlier on that we first met about 20 years ago, and the discussion point that we had, in fact, many of you know the old Skipping Girl building right opposite our office in Richmond. And we had a long discussion there, and the discussion point was the world's supply of grain, and the cost of wheat versus the cost of the wheat bix, which might appear on our table. I don't know that we resolved or did any of that. As I know Kerr is about to come to the platform, I am enormously aware that I have personally, on behalf of Wilson Gutierrez, got a lot of clients in here, and it's all right for Kerr to come along and talk about his fund, etc., because it's his fund. but I get the job of explaining it to clients. And I do understand at times I can get a little emotional and a little carried away, and I do explain, so this is to protect me in case Kerr says something to the opposite, that Kerr doesn't give a damn about what anybody else thinks, that he has a bias away from the US and, as I said, into the Asian markets, that he probably would buy a share in Iceland or Greenland or any land if he can find a $10 share for $5. Please, I've been doing this for quite some time. In case any of my clients do go home and check on the internet, or indeed at question time, Kerr, I do understand that Platinum do not have any investments in Iceland or Greenland. Technically, Iceland does have a stock exchange, or it's actually managed by the NASDAQ. But Greenland indeed does not have a stock exchange at all. But it was the vibe that I have been trying to impart. So talking about vibe, it's my opportunity to introduce Kerr Neilson to the platform, to tell you a little bit of his story and to ensure that you go home much better informed maybe than the way that you've arrived today. So on behalf of Wilson Peters, Kerr.
Thank you very much for all being here today, and I shall do my best to keep you engaged. If, however, it becomes boring, just make a very loud yawn or some other protest and I'll divert my attention to something that you might want to talk about. I can talk endlessly about shares and markets, but that is a transient delivery I'd give you. I'd only be able to tell you what I'm seeing right now. So rather than do that, what I'd prefer to do this evening is to give you the principles of investing. And that sounds heavy, but you'll get the drift of what I'm talking about quite quickly, I think. Because really what I'm trying to do is help you behave better under stress. Because the problem with the world of decision making, and this applies to whether you're buying property, whether you're in your own business, or whether you're investing in shares, if you actually look at your behavior, it's often led by your emotions. And I'll talk more about that. But so just to round this out, when you employ someone like ourselves to manage your affairs, you might think our job is simply to pick the world's best companies, choose how much you put in each of them, and end up with a portfolio. At a very high level, that might be true, it might not be true, because each fund manager has a different approach. Each big pool of assets has a different approach to managing your money. One might be buying growth stocks and only growth stocks. One might be following momentum, or if you look at ourselves, we tend to be contrarian. So we're trying to find pools of opportunity which others tend to overlook because of their psychological bias. Now here's the trick I'm going to play, which is to give you a picture of a matrix which we use to try and sort ideas. So, that's still from my earlier one.
That was a good slide.
I know what I'm doing, I'm going backwards. So, this is a matrix. If you look on the horizontal, what you have is a measure of conviction, high conviction or low conviction. And then on the vertical, you have the troublesome matter of evidence. So if I think about this and I think of the typical client I meet, and I say, well, what is the asset you really love? And we'll ignore the numbers at the moment. We'll just look at conviction. I think up in this top right corner, you'll say Australian property or Australian housing. And the second thing you might have high conviction about, because you feel you know, this is about feelings, remember? You feel you know more about Australian stocks, so you'll stack in below this perhaps Australian stocks. So that would be your first lineup. And then I say, well, what else would you like to have your money in? What other assets? And you'll begrudgingly perhaps say bonds, global bonds, and you might then say global shares. So we'll put those in the, oh, sorry, I keep doing this. We'll put those lot in. So now we've got a matrix. Now should we just look at the evidence? So let's look at the last 10 years. What is your feeling about this? Where do you think you've had the best returns in a statistical sense? Australian property, equities, Australian equities shares, bonds or whatever. Who would vote for the first one, Australian shares? There's no trick here. Well, I'll give you the numbers to make it simple. Remarkably, where we might have had very high conviction, it hasn't necessarily been the highest returning assets in the last 10 years. Remarkably, for the first time in a long time, bonds have given a return approaching that of shares. And in fact, global shares have been the most profitable in this 10-year period, but of course that's selected for one period of time. So from this, I'm asking you, when you have high convictions, to just always, and you tend to lead with convictions, not facts, try and rebalance that more towards, well, let me look at the data first. Because if I show you the next chart, which is about global returns, American returns, what you'll see is we've had a quite extraordinary 117 years of returns from US shares. That's 9.5% compound. It is huge. And you compare that with bonds, which is just under 5. Inflation over this 117-year period has been about 3%. Now, some of you might feel this is rather boring and rather heavy numbered. It's too many numbers, but I'll talk later about what's the base rate. And so some of these are very important ratios, because remember, you're comparing your property interests, your local shares and other shares and bonds, and the choice of being in cash. So these numbers, somewhere you must have a register of an approximation of where they fit. So that's quite intriguing. But if you look at this American graph, the light blue, do you notice that it is actually steepened? That curve is steepened. So what we have is the strangest thing in this over 100 years. If you actually looked at the first 50 years, so right up to 1949, return from international shares, so I'm not looking at America alone, I'm looking at global portfolio, would have given you 3.1% in that first 50 years, and you got twice that return in the second period. So what was happening? Why do you think globally you made more money in the last 67 years than in the first 50 years of this last 117? What do you think was happening? I'll tell you what happened. In the first 50 years, earnings for most companies struggled to keep up with global growth, with nominal world output. And in the second part of this quarter of the century, what actually happened is companies became more profitable, and the share of profits that came to workers and to holders of capital grew faster than the overall economy. The profit share, if you think of this globe, and you either have money going to labour or going to those who have assets, in the second half of this last century, it went to those who owned assets and less to labour. What was happening? You had automation. You had the loss of being paid for skills. You had the emergence of a new labour pool in the form of Asia from the 80s onwards. There was a shift in the balance of labour capital bargaining power. So you got this very big shift, and in the States, companies that in the first part of the last century suddenly made a lot more money. Return on capital, ROE, return on shareholders' funds, equity. Is this interesting or boring? Interesting? Okay, I'll keep going. So this is important because it shows the way folk with savings were the winners in this last period, whereas in the first period they were not. Now the problem with this is you had the share of the cake going to people with capital, but you also had the remarkable feature, which is on every dollar of earnings you received, you were paid a higher premium, you were paid a higher multiple, the valuation kicked up. So there were two things happening. You not only got a bigger share of the cake, but for every dollar you earned, instead of being valued at about 12 times earnings, it was valued at 16 times earnings. So 16 years of value was attributed to every dollar of earnings versus about 12 in the first part of this period. But will this persist? In all likelihood, it will change in due course. And so we will have this clash of these waves when that no longer persists. So when there's actually a revaluing of labour and a devaluing the return on capital. Can I see that happening imminently? I cannot. But I ask people to think about what this, this revolution, what I call the superhighway, is all about. The internet is changing relationships across all industries, all industries. I cannot think of an exception, and I'm delighted in you pointing out an exception. So here we have an interesting situation. For example, in terms of protection of of consumer rights, much of the legislation in the Western world has been directed at getting rid of monopolies and protecting consumers. And then the whole focus has been on protecting consumers from price gouging by companies. But what is actually happening today, to some extent, is Facebook and Google are using your personal information and gouging companies. They're using information to match up buyers and sellers through advertising or through a platform. There's a huge change here. So that's why one can't know, but what one must be aware of is we're in a world of huge change, and that's my job as an investor, to think through and try and keep in mind that what was a linear certainty cannot be taken for granted. We will get shocks. The superhighway will give each of us quite a shock at some stage. If you're a retailer today, you've already felt the first shock waves. If you're in media, I mean, think of Netflix. Netflix has absolutely thundered into people's drawing rooms, sitting rooms, wherever they watch television or on their mobiles. And it will change a lot of things. So we love this stuff because it's all about tomorrow. And we've got to think about tomorrow. The trouble with many of us as investors is we allow our emotions to lead at what we're familiar with, we feel comfortable with. What we're not familiar with, we want to sort of brush aside. We cannot. This is coming, this type of change. But here's the good news. Over a long period of time, I've suggested to you shares don't do badly. They give you some huge returns. But this is an interesting graph. So just look at the first bar, if you would, please. So what it's showing you is in a 5-year span, we're looking for the worst time you could have owned shares. So let's say you came in late September 1929, and what was your return over the next 5 years? Or late October in 2000, what was your return? And what it shows you is for the next 5 years, if you come in at the very worst time, you stood to lose about 70% of your money. And not a pleasant experience at all. That would cure you of anyone ever wanting to own shares. Alternatively, if you had been so fortunate as to buy at the best time after one of those crashes, you would have made 3.5 times your money in 5 years. And if you look at that graph, this line that you see is the zero line. If you look at that graph, in fact, there's a huge skewing. In any typical 5-year period, you have the very real prospect of making about 6 to 8%. That's your typical skew. So I've given you your worst case and your best case. The best case is hugely different. So on 10-year view, if you'd held shares and bought well, you could have made 5.5 times your money. And what you could have lost is 50%. So there's a huge skewing to the positive. I'm not saying you can't lose money. Don't please believe that for a second. But I'm trying to give you a sense of what I call the implicit trend of these things. What is the implicit look of this creature we call the stock market? So, I then ask you, I want now you to look at that quite. So now I say to you, which is more damaging, wars or people's psychology? Which is more damaging? It is not wars, it is psychology. Let's have a look at that. So here you have, in the First War, if you were in Japan, which benefited, in fact, from the loss of industry in Europe, particularly the Germans, they did fine in that war. The Second War wasn't a great success though, for them. And it was fine for Britain and America, strangely. So wars are destructive, there's no question, but they needn't be very damaging to those of us who own shares. Quite the contrary applies when people lose their minds and in panic. There's huge drawdowns. But what is really stunning, look at that 2000, look under Germany. Germany was not the epicenter of the tech boom. It was not. And yet, you lost 58% of your money in that sell-off. So it's quite interesting. What you would think is a relationship doesn't necessarily pertain, doesn't necessarily hold. So, the important message here is, over a long period of time, shares do pretty well. If you look at a single market, you will tend to have too narrow a spread, and when you have a setback, you don't have the cushioning of other markets. If you look at the aggregation of a broad spectrum of markets, you have a chance of making good money. Now this is a really interesting thing. When have you really been killed by owning shares? Not just the 50% wipeout, but total wipeout. I need participation, please.
Ask the question again.
Sorry?
Ask the question.
Where have you really been completely denuded of assets by owning shares?
When they went out.
When they went out. They went out in 1917 in Russia, and they went out in 1949 in China. But here's the interesting point. I gave you those returns, and the long-term return, as I said, is 5.1 by having a portfolio of global shares. Even if you had a weighting that was appropriate for the size of the market in China and Russia, in those when they went out, which I think is a very nice way of putting it, when they went out, it had less than 1/10 of 1% change in that 5% return. It barely changed it. because you're talking about long periods of time, and you're actually talking about two index ratings at the time which might have been 10%. So it might have had 10% of that index. Russia in the early times, I think, was about 7% before it went out, and then China would have been about 6 or 5 in 1949. So that's really interesting to me. And interestingly, if you had been a serviceman in Germany in 1939 and you had been sent off to fight the Russians on the Eastern Front, by 1954, you were ahead of the game already. Whereas if you had had a nice house in Berlin, the chances are it would be nothing more than a flat piece of land with a lot of rubble on it. So shares are really interesting. And here's the important thing. How many of you run your own businesses? It becomes more apparent when you run your own business. But remember, whether you're an owner of shares or not, the success of your companies determines your own success in that organization. And in aggregate, it doesn't matter which company you're working for, if those companies aren't working well, it affects our entire livelihood. There is no way of escaping this capitalist model we have unless we go back to some sort of pre-planned system. So it's not as if you're taking a risk that you don't understand. Your employer might be listed, most chances are that it is. So you can't escape this decision. There's no point in pretending it's not absolutely the core of our whole system. And I say this, which is a bit fatuous, but it's real. Companies create wealth, create jobs, create innovation. Governments do not. And if anyone would like to argue the point, I'll set you aside 2 hours and we'll discuss it ad nauseum after this and 10 bottles of wine. Because it is the fact, it is the system works well. I'm not saying for a moment that you cannot have a centrally planned system with the type of artificial intelligence we've got and the type of integrated supply chains we could create through the internet. I'm not saying we have to keep the capitalist system, but I can tell you one thing. When you have government institutions, they're not agile and they're not actually interested in the outcome for the consumer because there's no way you can sack them. Sack them in terms of your use of their products or use of their services. Now that's home truths, boring, but it's real. This is really interesting. If you look at the world and you read the media, you always think it's about to fall apart. What this shows is the growth in world activity going back 117 years. What you see is, and by the way, the zigzag line above it is showing you the year-on-year change. Since the 1950s, we have not gone, except for 2009, where we had a slight dip below, we went into slight negative territory. We have not had a global recession for the last 67 years. Or call it, with one exception, and a tiny setback in 2009. So what has happened in this period, we've had more intervention by governments to try and offset downturns. We've seen much higher transfer payments. I mean, in the 20s, you didn't get transfer payments, you didn't get pension funds, you had to look after yourself. That shifted from 1950 onwards. The whole Keynes revolution of economic management changed the way we look at that. So that's really interesting. Now, some of you might say, well, you know, things can change and what have you. But we live in a world of huge disparities. None of us can misunderstand that. And if you think of the change in the world since the 1950s, what we had is first Germany rebuilding itself, then you had, and the whole of Europe benefiting, You then had the Japanese rebuilding their industrial machine, and that went right through from really the late 50s. This was a country, incidentally, in the 30s that derived nearly half its exports from textile exports. Japan. By the 1970s, it was a machinery exporter, an automobile exporter. Things changed dramatically. So then we had Japan come through, then we had the emerging countries of Southeast Asia, and then we had China kicking in by the late 1980s and really flowering in the 1990s. So you can start worrying, well, what's going to happen next? Surely this is now being fully expressed. Well, the fact is that in places like Indonesia and India, the rural population is still huge. Up to not so long ago, a decade ago, the rural population in China was more than 60%. It's now about 45%. When people move into cities, it completely changes the demand for resources. You need sewerage. You can't simply go behind the tree anymore. You need water carriage. You need roads, railways. You need bridges. There's a huge transformation. And this is best captured in the use of energy and the use of metals. Now, this may interest you. On the horizontal axis of the next chart, it shows you the degree of urbanization. So China is now over 50, India is still at 35. So here you see that India is using about 2.7 kilos of copper per head per year. China already, because it's not only using it for its own needs now, it's started to export air conditioners and fridges and cars, it's already using close to 7. And then the developed world, so-called, is using more like 8 or whatever. So what we have here is an almost irresistible need for more material, as we have, several billion people still living, many billion, most probably 4 billion, still living outside of cities. And some of you might say to me, oh yes, but we're going to go green, we're going to somehow use less fossil fuels, less hydrocarbons. This has been the pattern of hydrocarbon usage. As living standards, now that the bottom axis is living standards, and we're talking here about income rather than standards, but anyway. Once you get up to 25, 30,000 of income per year, you start stabilizing your amount of this is in million BTUs, British thermal units. It's the amount of energy you require in a society. So in China, it's running at about 50. In the rest of the world, it's about 100, and that's the developed world. In India, it might be even 15. So there's a huge build-up of need for energy. I mean, America's off the scale, as you can see. So they could help by just cutting back a bit. But I don't think under this president they're going to do much. Australia, we can't be very pleased with ourselves. I mean, we use too much energy. And I don't fully understand that because we don't have the steel works we used to have. We don't have the alumina works we used to have. It's extravagance. But you can see the numbers. You can see why, over the next 10, 15 years, some of these markets are just going to be hugely pressured to supply more materials, be it metals, be it energy. So the problem on the left is showing you where the energy is. So these are the forecasts by BP, and where it's going to be in the supply of electrical energy to buildings, to houses. And even though the world uses just under 100 million barrels of oil per day, that's how much we use, 100 million barrels per day, approximately. On motor fuels for light vehicles, we're using about, I'll round it off, 20 million. So even though we will thrift, and in old measure, we're now doing cars that do 50 miles per gallon. We're using 4.5 liters per 100, 4.5 litres per 100 kilometres. So the efficiency is more than doubled. And will continue to improve as we go to batteries and hybrids. But the fact is, because of this urbanisation, there's just this huge demand from another couple of billion people, which puts Australia in a pretty nice position, because we've just been spending quite a lot of money on all these gas fields. We've been linking them up in Darwin. So we've got quite an interesting position here, and we've got food and what have you. We're not in a bad position, and we'll be able to supply these countries, but where we will fall short is we don't have all the elaborate manufactured goods which are what we tend to import. So when these prices are weak, we take a bath. So, and this is a cyclical business. So this is what's really interesting. So I tell you this glorious story about the demand for materials, but today they're completely out of fashion. So what this is showing you is the value of a pool of interesting companies, whether it's an Exxon, BP, BHP, and Rio. That pool has never been cheaper in terms of its valuation against the rest of the market. I'm talking about a global opportunity set here. So it's interesting, because on one hand I'm telling you there's plenty of demand, and yet the market's not interested. Another area of the market's not interested is automobiles. They say, no, we're not interested in automobiles because there's going to be electrification, it's going to cost them a lot of money to transform them into electrical drives and so on. And I can give you a whole lot of stories on that. So there's not interest there. Where the interest is in biotech and in software. So vice versa, software and biotech. So it's an interesting world we're in, where as contrarians we're trying to shift our portfolio from where the heat is to where it's cooler, and where logic prevails rather than emotions. And so we're tending to put more money in Asia, and slightly, well, at the moment we've actually got net shorts against our US position, which is now accounts for 54% of the value of listed shares around the world. 54% for an economy that produces about 16 to 18% of world output. Interesting. Today, China produces more manufactured goods than the US. It has a weighting of 3.5% in this index. Does that sound sensible? If you look back in 1900, Britain had a weighting of 50% in the index. America had a weighting of 25%. Britain today has a weighting in the index of about 8%. It's where the wealth is created that the index will go, not vice versa. So it's an interesting story there. And we have been taking our positions up in those unattractive, so-called unattractive areas which no one likes, and tending to take money out of information technology, which is adored by most investors, and indeed some of them are very interesting. We still have them, but I'm simply trying to convey to you the way a contrarian would look at the world, rather than following the heat of the crowd, try to take the emotions out, look at the facts. And you'll see a fact I'll give you in a moment which will surprise you. So over time, we have, by doing this shifting from where the heat is to where it's cool, we've outperformed the index by a factor of 2. And that factor of 2 over a long period of time, so when I say 2, the index, the compounding has been over 12% versus 6. That 6 accords with the numbers I showed you earlier, as you remember. But the wealth effects of compounding at 12% versus 6 is a difference of, what is it, Charlie?
14 versus 4,
Yeah, 14 times your money versus 4. So compounding, that 6% difference doesn't sound like much, but over 24 years it is huge. But you can't do that simply by wanting to be with the crowds. It feels very uncomfortable. It feels uncomfortable to be in China today because Mr. Trump is making life hard for them. To some extent, they may well have deserved it. They have been stealing technology, they have been making things that were without paying for licenses. So to some extent he's correct. But on the other hand, he's going to damage the consumer in the States by bringing these big tariffs in, and it's just going to be paid for by the consumer. So I'm not taking sides, I'm simply seeing it as it is. I mean, I've been in meetings where we were talking about technology, it's very clear what's been happening. So that's an interesting case. Now I'm just going to end off, because I'm running a bit out of time, with one of the lectures put out by a really brilliant practitioner of this business. His name's Michael Mobisson, and he has 5 areas where he says the average investor gets it horribly wrong. And these are the areas that he gets wrong. The typical investor doesn't have a base rate, and by that I mean he'll have his strong feelings about his technology stock or whatever, and he will always attribute a weight to his own opinion rather than looking outside his immediate circle for information. And I'll give you an example of this. I could give you 2 companies today, one selling at a 14% earnings yield, 7p, 14, and it's called Samsung. It's a very fine company, makes high profits. You know their phones, you know their screens, you know their memory chips when you dig into your computer. It's giving us $14 a year, and probably will do so for at least the next 10 years. It may grow, but let's suppose it doesn't grow. Over the next 10 years, it'll generate, let's say, $140 for $100 investment. Alternatively, I could give you a company like Google, which is selling at about 25 times earnings, so it's giving you $4 today. How fast has Google got to grow to generate the same cash flow to match up with my $140? What is its growth rate got to be? 26% per year for the next 10 years. %. So this is the point of a base rate. How many companies of over $1 billion have grown at between 20 and 30% a year over the subsequent 10 years? It's about 1 in 20, about 4%. So your odds aren't great. So when someone pitches to you, this is a great company, look how fast it's growing, the base rate mentality is to say, yes, but how often has that happened? It happens, but your odds aren't great. So I'm not saying it can't happen, I'm simply saying the odds aren't great. And that's the first message about base rate. The second one, which is important when investing, is most companies grow and then gradually slow down. It's called regression to the mean. Good companies regress more slowly because it's not luck, it's actually good management or good business. Whereas bad companies regress faster. So you need to look at that when you look at company. You need to also, and it's a mistake I constantly make, is not be overconfident. Overconfidence is not being full of yourself, it's simply not having a wide enough aperture of how well things can do and how badly they can do. I tend to have a too narrow, I use more of a sort of, I think it's a heavy gauge shotgun rather than a very light gauge shotgun. You need to have spread when you think about outcomes. So when you're buying a stock, it can often be much worse than you think or much better than you think. And many of us don't have enough aperture when we look at ideas. And when someone tells you about something, you tend to extrapolate from your recent experience, and if it's been good, you'll tend to think it's going to be good and not look at the downside. So that's another one. And then valuations. This is the biggest trick that you must please take in tonight, because this is important. So I've got here, which is slightly contradictory, but it's not, to what I've been saying earlier. If I've got two companies, one's on 10 times earnings and another's on 25 times earnings, you'll say, oh, the 25 times earnings is expensive. I think that would be our immediate response. If the company selling on 10 times earnings is a steelworks, over the next few years, it works out, I won't go through all the arithmetic, but over the next 10 years, typically a steelworks will need to use all its current earnings over the next 10 years to double its capacity. That's how the arithmetic works, making about a 10% sales margin. So in year 11, if they choose to build a new steelworks, they'll have to take all the money back from you from the last 10 years and bung it back into a steelworks, and then you'll have twice the amount of steel, but still no cash out of the business. If you buy Google by comparison, you only get the $4 in the first year, and then you'll get the $5 in the next year. Over the next 10 years, they can grow immensely without reinvesting more than a very small fraction of what they earn. So when you look at a high valuation in terms of earnings power and a PE, be careful that you understand, is it a cash flow PE or is it a cash flow PE or is it an illusional PE? And lastly, when you look at companies, you'll tend to pool them by similarities, but what you should really do is be careful of that, because you think one retailer is the same as another, and they're not. Amazon is not the same as Coles. One has a very different model to the other. So you need to look at the features, and they come from the financials of the company. So what I've tried to give you tonight is an impression that over time, you'll be tending to lead with your emotions rather than the facts. Please try to avoid that. Over time, shares will give you very nice returns, even though some of the factors that have helped shares in the recent times can erode, you still make good returns. Thirdly, and the most important thing is you need diversity. Simply because you don't have the same familiarity with the name of a foreign company, don't think you know it better, or you know BHP better than that company. You know some working aspects of BHP, but you don't really know the inner workings with great respect unless you work for the company. So you're familiar with the name, but simply because it's some strange company 10 years ago called Amazon, that shouldn't have put you off. So you're deluding yourself with supposed familiarity. You need spread. And as I've shown you here, international shares over the last 10 years have given you at least as much as Australian shares. Over the last 100 years, a good portfolio has given you nearly as much as Australian shares. Australian, Canadian, and South African shares over the last 100 years have been among the best, I must acknowledge. South Africa is going the other way now. Argentina was in that list at one stage, it's gone the other way. I'm not suggesting we're going the other way, but it's a thought worth entertaining. So you cannot possibly think it is safe to have your money all in one ship. It is not smart. And over time, if you pick half sensible fund managers, they can do quite well for you. So I hope that's been of interest, and I'd love to take questions and see if I can answer those easily.
Well, thank you very much, Kerr, for your presentation. It's been most informative. If you'd all like to especially join in a big round of applause. So we would like to have all your questions thrown up to Kerr to answer. So I think, do we have perhaps anyone in the room? I might kick off with the first question, Kerr, and that is, the presentation is largely about the psychology towards investing and having the right mindset. To what extent does the almost instantaneous pricing of equities impact people's decisions versus, say, direct property, where it's at times very difficult to gauge price or value until you actually ultimately list a property for sale.
It's hugely influential. The trouble is with shares, you think you've just lost a lot of money, and you have indeed if you realise them when they've had a bad sell-off. And the way we rationalise that is we say, has that company deteriorated fundamentally? So when we do our analysis, we have a set of milestones, kilometre measures of where the company, what the company needs to achieve over the next several years. So we don't have necessarily, it's not entirely numbers based. We want to see certain things happen. We want to see a change in their product mix. We want to see a whole lot of things happen. So when we buy a share, we tend to firstly say, how crowded is this trade? How many people agree with us? We prefer that they're few. We like to be on our own, because when there's a lot of people agreeing with you, it tends to be in the share price. So the first thing we're looking for is interesting companies that are changing, or just being hammered for some unreasonable reason, and it's transient. We then map out what we think should happen to this company over the next while. So we find the share price drops. There's only one inquiry in our organization, is what has changed to the business, not the share price. They're not synonymous. They're not the same thing at all. We don't get comfort, particularly by the share price matching what we think the company's doing, either when it's going up or down. What we want to see is the underlying earnings power keep growing. So for a lay investor, they fall apart in many cases because the share price has dropped. But they're not looking at the right thing. Those of you who run businesses know, 1 year you will have a bad year. It doesn't change the inherent value of your business. Remember, when a typical company sells at 14, 15 years of earnings, 15 years. So for you to go and hammer the life out of a stock because it's done something or fallen short in one single year, are you really seriously saying that it now can no longer achieve what you had in mind over the next 14, 15 years? It's irrational. Sometimes you need to, because sometimes there's been, the management's fallen apart. There's other bigger developments where there's been a fundamental shift. But for the typical company, it's just a setback because of sales not quite being as good as the market was expecting. That shouldn't change the underlying value. Or, as you had in Netflix in the first quarter this year, the market got too excited and they paid too much for this supposed growth leviathan.
Who do you think will be the winners and losers out of Trump's trade wars and the opportunities because of that?
The question was, who will be the winners and losers out of Trump's trade wars?
The right answer is the consumer. It's not easy to bring back jobs, manufacturing jobs, to the developed world. But the labour gap is huge. The labour cost gap is huge. We're talking about average wages, $20 an hour and higher. In the motor belt in the US and in other parts of the world, $3 or so an hour. So you can't really change it. And even under this new agreement with Mexico and Canada, there's a little weasel clause where you can sell cars into America with a 2.5% tariff on top. So I don't see a huge change. He's doing some interesting things. He is drawing a picture of how America should reinvigorate itself. To that extent, he's doing some sensible things, and he's making people think about that, and he's shaming companies when they simply fire people because they're too lazy to think of a better way of doing things with the existing labour force. So to that extent, I think he's doing some interesting stuff. But who's going to lose? I think the consumer will be paying more for all this stuff. And longer term, you're going to cut out a whole interchange of ideas and what have you, so I don't think it's very good. You know, you're interfering with the marketplace, and the market works reasonably well over time. Companies, I don't think at this stage will take the pain. It'll be the consumer who pays more. But what you could have in certain areas in America is that there's a huge tightness of labour. So, for example, in plant builders, so people with welding and construction skills, there's just a huge shortage now. So we might see little pockets of price inflation, but I don't think we're in an inflation age. I think there's the pool of labour outside America, I think, precludes that. The cost of automation has been dropping, so you can actually put in production lines for a fraction of what you could in the old days. You know, you've got so many of these devices that can be strung together, and they're all now, the science is understood, the know-how is understood, so you've got about 7 suppliers who can give you an automated line and this sort of thing or that sort of thing. So I don't think we've got back to the point where we see the sort of inflation.
Talk to us a little bit about active passive and the current thinking about it as to whether the bulk of our money should, if we're going to go international, should be passively invested and then just put a little extra to managers who might be able to do something over and above. So looking at the chart, that still seems the way to go.
We've had this huge excitement about the beauty of passive, and it's been an express train, and it's been appropriate because you've had the US market's share of the MSCI grow from about 34% 30 years ago to now 54%. So as long as you had exposure to the US market through the MSCI, you've made very nice returns from passively owning that index. You could also have picked a different time when Japan was 40% of that index. And if you'd been heavily weighted in Japan, you would have been hammered down from 40 to 8% of the index. So your time frames are always critical. And right now, as I say, do you really want to be passive and have 54% of your money in the US and believing it's going to continue to hold that position when it's, as I say, 16 to 18% of world output? Maybe not. So we have no problem at all with ETFs. We love them. And we love them for 2 reasons. One is it allows the average investor to have a cheap access to global markets or markets generally. But secondly, we also know that in the chase to be with the crowd, in a lithium or battery stock, there's huge crowding, the stocks get very overpriced, and it's a wonderful opportunity for us to short or to sell. So we're not at all negative about passive. We simply say that the more the markets move towards passive, the more imperfections you will have. So our Japan fund has a history of growing. It was founded in 1998. It has grown at 15.5% compound since then, for 20 years. That's a huge return. What's that, Dean?
15 against 3.2.
What's that?
15 per
And
annum.
what is it in terms of total value?
1,500%.
Yeah, 1,500% in a totally discordant economy, who, as a passive investor, you wouldn't have wanted to play. So there is skill in this. I can tell you how hard it is, and I'm not, I don't care. I'd love to say it's not hard. I just do a 40-hour week.
Any other questions?
So then, as passive investing grows, does active investing become easier?
Yes, because what you're having, as passive grows, it is not, you see, this is good, thank you for that planted question. When we build a portfolio up, we build by each company. So we buy each specific stock. And if you look at the portfolio, the top 20 companies account for about 50% of the portfolio. So we have a sort of, it's like a hen with chicks. You know each of the chicks. It's not just a flock of them. Whereas when you're with passive, you're in the problem of you have, when you get a downdraft, you can't look at your individual chicks and say, well, that business has not changed, that business has not changed, that's not changed. And it gives you that sense of security, not that you're needing it, you're simply saying, that's what I do. I find most companies that are incorrectly priced. And you build the portfolio off that. So you have confidence. You know, we've got blasted in China. But in fact, the stocks got cheaper, so we're inclined to buy more. So we don't suddenly become all emotional and say, if the stocks had stopped performing as we'd expected, then we need to recalibrate. But because you've got something very tangible in your layout for each individual company, it gives you huge comfort in saying, well, there's nothing changed here.
So, what's your strategy for Brexit? How are you going to deal with that?
It's a conundrum for the longer or the medium-term outlook for Britain in terms of if they do not participate in this customs union, they're just going to lose a lot more of the industry they still have. There'll just be marginal less interest in it as a destination for investment. So if you think of what was happening in the 80s when the Japanese were starting to buy in there, it was because it was a stepping stone into Europe. And so it is, I think it's a bad choice by the people. And the regulation they talk about is what May is proposing to keep anyway. So all this nonsense that was floated around about being so negative for the country, being beholden to a central unelected group, has some merit, not as much as was proposed. What is interesting, though, is Europe itself might break up at some stage, because the idea that you have this discordance in terms of productivity between the northern countries and the southern countries is huge. You don't have the same level of debt across this whole system. You don't have the same mentality about getting things done. So longer term, it may not be a cost to the country, but in the short term, I think it'll be a big shock. And we don't have any specific manufacturing companies there, and we have a very, very low exposure there. Our exposure is through the mining companies like Glencore, which is it's a pass-through, it's just a headquarters. In fact, their headquarters is in Zug, but it's listed in London. So we don't have any particular exposure. But as I say, it's a more fraught discussion when you think about the short term and the long term. The long term, Europe has got some real issues, and then you've got despots in both Hungary and Poland, so you're trying to keep these guys in line. You've got total disagreements about movement of workers, in fact, because you've got this, whether they're guest workers or not. Europe's going to find it difficult, but to be outside a big bargaining bloc in a world where you're getting three huge blocs developing, I think is damaging in the short term. But longer term, do we really think these trading blocs matter, these 10%, type of impositions on your exports? I think that largely will be removed over the next 15 years. So this whole idea of tariffs and what have you, I think will gradually be removed. And so what you're seeing is countries being attracting new investment because they're just saying, well, this is not persistent, this won't hold for all this time.
Time for one last question.
When you're assessing the fundamentals of what shares to invest in and what companies, where on your scale would you put looking at the board?
Looking at
board membership.
Right.
So the question was, to what extent is the board of directors critical in determining the success of corporations?
Because when they get bankers in there, bankers chop R&D, bottom line, fire 10% of the staff.
Or accountants do that as well.
You're being too kind. You're being far too kind.
Yes.
And the trouble is, we've gone through this horrific period of you know, public confiscation of wealth from shareholders to management boards. So here we have, you can think of the number of companies where there's no skin in the game whatsoever, and these folk wander off with a lot of money, and they defend themselves. I've sat through some of these meetings where they defend themselves. They say, well, no, if we don't pay he, she, or it more money, they'll wander. And you say, that'd be good. But it is just the time. Just like you know, trend investing, which is partly to do with this passive. The trend will break soon. The trend is starting to be questioned, and you're seeing it today, you know, in this paper today about Telstra. We look at the board quite carefully, and something that we also look at is when they make big decisions about when they divest something or when they take change of course. That's very important. But the fact is that for the moment we're hostage to this notion of the remuneration committee. We're each scratching each other's backs. And I can say this because I think I was the lowest paid CEO on the listed sector, so I can gladly cast stones at many greenhouses because I was interested in the business and building a business, and many of these folk, which is even worse, don't stay for longer than 5 years in that role. So it's all about jipping up the numbers, buying back stock, and doing some pretty bad stuff. And there is the cost longer term to the capitalist system. So that's why I speak out. I particularly like this system, not because it's made me money, but because I think it is a fair allocation of resources over time. Good companies have to look after their workers. It's not a matter of whether they should or shouldn't. They have to, good companies, the ones that really do things. And so the whole thing is quite contained and valuable for society. But you need to understand that you have a duty to society. And in this payments-driven mania, we often, and short term, we lose sight of that. So I feel terribly strongly about this stuff, and I speak out when they were talking about the tax cuts to the corporate sector. It's the biggest load of twaddle ever. You can only do business in this country if you're here. Where are you going to go and get your other tax rate? You're not going to get a different tax rate. It's not going to change investment. Either we have a competitive advantage or we do not. The tax rate's not going to make a damn difference. But you get all this drivel in the newspapers. You can see I get a bit excited. All this drivel about we've got to drop taxes because that's the world trend. It is rubbish. So we do think a bit about this stuff.
Well, thank you, Kerr. Thank you very much for today's presentation. Thanks for all of your insights and advice to the room, and we really appreciate your time here today.